popular image of Spain. Beaches, sun, a country in which to relax and indulge your holiday dreams. But just a few hundred meters from the seafront at Malaga, Spaniards are digging up the remains of a nightmare. "70 years after the end of the Civil War, the remains of thousands who fought and died for the democratically elected Republican government are being discovered. They were thrown into mass, unmarked graves. And as the full horror of Spain's dark past emerge, families look for the thousands of children stolen by the regime.
For me, what is important is that this story should live, because I'm looking for a sister, and my parents are looking for a daughter who they have never known."
Madrid, 1975, and the funeral of General Franco. All sides agreed to forget the Civil War and 3 decades of brutal dictatorship and move on. Only now, 34 years after the dictator's death, and perhaps emboldened by 3 decades of political stability, Spain is undergoing a Rip Van Winkle moment. Old men who, as children, watched their fathers taken off to be executed, now give vent to their pain.
My father was murdered, not killed because he deserved it. He was killed by those who in those days went around calling themselves nationalists. But who were these people? Do nationalists go around killing fellow Spaniards, supporters of a democratically elected government?
The program of exhumations began a few years ago on the initiative of family members and paid for by individuals and charities. Now only partly funded by the government, they rely on armies of volunteers. Antonio says he's here to find and rebury his father with due honor. Maria says she's here on account of her grandfather. The young are as indignant as the old. They complain they weren't told the truth about the Civil War at school, and now they want to know.
It's a bit late, but better late than never. The work we're doing here is important. It should be done all over Spain.
It is. 700 kilometers to the north and a grave outside the village of Milagros. Communal graves are found outside nearly every village where Republicans were rounded up, shot and dumped in ditches. 70 years on, local people can tell the teams of volunteers exactly where to dig to find them. A man turns up with a letter that his 16-year-old uncle wrote after being picked up. Not knowing that he was about to be shot along with his trade unionist father, he writes asking for bread, paper and a pen. A volunteer uncovers the skeleton of a young boy. It could be him. The living and the dead will be DNA tested to confirm. A woman waits for news of her grandfather, who was a local mayor at the outbreak of the war. The grave is believed to contain some 28 former mayors and trade union leaders. The way the bodies are found suggests that they were shot at the edge of the ditch and thrown in. The grave here is evidence of the plan at the beginning of the war to purge the area of the local leaders of the democratically elected left-wing Republican government. After all, Franco said his intention was to rid Spain of Marxism, whatever it took, even if it meant killing half its people. Some 500,000 were killed during the Civil War of 1936 to 39, with equal casualties on both sides. But the execution of Franco's enemies continued well after his victory parades. To survive, everyone had to march to the conqueror's tune. General Mola, seen here to the right of Franco, declared, "We have to sow terror. We must eliminate without scruple all those who don't think like ourselves." Supporters of the Republic were rounded up, sent to prison or executed. In desperation, they sent their children to Russia, France, and to Britain. But what about those who didn't get away? Only now, as people begin to talk about this period, evidence is emerging that some 30,000 children were forcibly removed from their parents, given to pro-Franco couples, or put into institutions where they were brainwashed and cruelly abused. Eugeniu Ablana says his life came to an end in 1936, when, at 5 years old, he was taken from his parents. His father had been a government driver and was imprisoned. His mother died. He spent 12 years in 4 different orphanages. Here at the first, he was called a son of a red by the priests, who, he says, had a fanatical hatred of anything of the left.
There was a priest who, when we were sitting at the table, either eating or writing, had a cane, and he would whip us on the neck if we used our left hand. On 2 occasions, as he leant over, a gun fell out of his robes and fell to the floor, and we realized he had a weapon he could kill with.
He was interned with his 3 brothers, all of whom later died of TB. The priest in charge, he says, used to abuse them sexually.
The priests collaborated completely with the phalangists who'd overthrown the government. They were paedophiles, and they converted me to atheism. They were bad, and I refused to believe a word they said.
At another orphanage run by the Auxilio Social, the social help set up by Franco, they were made to sing Falangist hymns like Cara al Sol, Face to the Sun, which celebrated the godliness of Franco's followers and which, 70 years on, he says, he still can't erase from his memory.
Formaré junto a mis compañeros que hacen guardia sobre los luceros. Y aquí, pues aquí fue donde empezó el auxilio social.
It was here at the Auxilio Social where the real punishment started. 1 night, 2 nights, up to 15 days without a meal at night, and other terrible punishments. I complained. I cried. But there was no one who cared. I never received any affection. Looking back on it, it's inexplicable.
Es inexplicable.
Eso no es absolutamente verdad.
This is absolutely not true. These people can say what they like, just as I can, but it is not true.
Dr. Felix Morales is spokesman for the Franco Foundation, set up to preserve the memory of General Franco and his 34-year dictatorship.
No es verdad. Hay unos muchachos, auxilio social.
It's not true. There was a process. I don't know anything about these stories, about what the priests and nuns did or any such nonsense. As all the people you spoke to well know, there was a department set up, the Auxilio Social, to look after poor children and war orphans.
He went on to claim that he had positive testimonies from children who had been looked after by the Auxilio Social. So do he and his fellow Franquistas have anything to apologize for?
These were the results of a civil war, señorita, with repercussions we can never forget. It was a cruel confrontation, especially at the beginning, because you had two sides who wanted to impose a political system, and they were armed, and it was violent.
All the crimes that took place during the Franco era be blamed on the Civil War? Those investigating the story of Spain under Franco are now saying that the abuse of the vulnerable and of children and the culture of impunity among officials, as they call it, lasted for several decades after the end of the Civil War. The grandly titled Association for the Recuperation of Historical Memory brings together academics, lawyers, and representatives of families who are trying to locate their loved ones. 34-year-old Mar Sortano Ruti says she's looking for her older sister, who was born in 1964, 25 years after the end of the war. Soon after her sister, Beatrix, was born, she explains, her parents were told that she had died, but they were never given the body to bury, even though they asked.
My parents were young, they weren't political. They came from very humble origins, and in that era, we now know that it wasn't like it is today. Politicians, professionals, the health authorities could do exactly what they wanted. People didn't question them.
The experts call it the era of impunity, which they say continued in Spain until the death of Franco in 1975.
It was a continuation of the political process of repression. It was a process which once consisted in getting rid of the real parents, either by putting them in prison or by executing them, and then taking the children into institutions run by the church and by the Auxilio Social. Those who had been doing this simply continued with political impunity, but with other objectives.
No one knows what those objectives were. It could have been financial. But it emerges that the same hospital in Madrid told several lots of parents that their babies had died. The hospital today claims that the 8 babies died of an ear infection. Not believing this, the parents have applied to the courts, but so far, not a single case has been heard. Their lawyers say the government should do more to help.
Pero en ningún caso la administración ni el gobierno puede interferir.
In no way can the government interfere or suggest to the courts how they should deal with something. That's their job. I don't believe that you can say that this government is not doing its best to address these issues. Though I can understand that some victims and their families might think we could do better.
Que las víctimas puedan querer o mejorar.
And yet, is Spain doing its best to confront the past? Franco memorabilia abound. Like the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen, thousands of political prisoners died while constructing the monument, where Mass is said every day around Franco's tomb. The Spanish government has ordered that symbols of his regime should be removed, and yet a vast monument to General Mola still stands. somewhat bizarrely, we found Franco's boat used as a tourist attraction at a restaurant hundreds of miles from the sea. In Madrid, a street named after the perpetrator of one of the worst atrocities of the war, and another after Franco himself. It might be difficult to remove huge monuments, but what about changing street names?
En cuanto a las calles, que es un poco lo que usted me plantea.
As far as the street names are concerned, it's up to the town halls. What I'm trying to say is that the central government has taken all measures possible to change and get rid of the symbols of the Franco era. But it is true that some local governments, led by certain political parties, have to take this decision themselves.
Símbolos de la época franquista.
Spain is divided over what it calls its historical memory, and the divisions lie along the old battle lines of the Civil War. A right-wing mayor presides over Burgos, which was Franco's headquarters during the conflict, and the plaques which celebrate Franco as a national hero are still in place. The surrounding area, where the exhumations at Milagros are taking place, is said to be still sympathetic to the dictator. And so I wasn't surprised when my attempt to talk to local people about the digging down the road was met with reluctance. We all agreed to forget these things when Franco died, they reminded me. It's been too many years, said this woman. Who's paying for all this, asks this man. Only one local, born well after the war, was prepared to go further. I'll get the butcher to talk to you, he said. He knows everything in the village. But after a bit, he came out explaining that the butcher wouldn't talk because the subject was incandente. That is, more than 70 years after the war, it's still an inflammatory subject. Back at the exhumations outside the village, the woman, waiting to find her grandfather, explains.
There are still two ways of thinking in Spain. 2 years ago, one side tried to start this, but the other side stopped it. They sent the police. I'm telling you, the repression still exists.
Emilio Silva, who was one of the first to locate his grandfather in a mass grave, is now organizing the exhumation program throughout Spain.
There needs to be some government structure to help them. It is inconceivable to me, and I'm the grandson of one of those who disappeared, that the victim of a violent act has to investigate it himself, has to resolve it with any help he can get, and has to organize his own reparation, when this should be done by the state.
I then asked him about the lost children.
Listen, the permanent seizure of a person is one of the worst infringements of human rights. In fact, in Argentina, this crime led to the prosecution of some of the military chiefs of the dictatorship. These children were taken from political prisoners. So it is a very serious infringement, and the government knows it, but is doing absolutely nothing to help to look for information, file their cases, or help families.
Fortunately, the person who owned the field where the grave was had always left that spot alone.
A British author living in Madrid who's written on the subject believes that it's more likely that the more recent events will force the country to take note.
I think the inevitable thing, yes, is for courts to get involved, for formal official investigation, quite possibly with the police involved, And that will then lead us to individuals who were involved in the events, who took part in kidnappings or disappearances. Whether they can be put on trial or not is a different question. Under Spanish law, that would probably be very complicated because crimes prescribe after a certain period of time.
The more recent cases have a better chance.
For me, what is important is that this story should live, because I'm looking for a sister, and my parents are looking for a daughter who they have never known.
Old men like Eugeniu tell their story to whoever will listen. He doesn't expect reparations, and he has no family left to find. But he wants people to know.
Ahora deben enterarse mis hijos y todos los niños.
My children and all the children should be aware of what happened. Criminality, genocide, carried out by the Catholic fascists. It was terrible.
Time is not on the side of those who survived the Civil War. But thanks to the energy and commitment of their children and grandchildren, the campaign to expose Spain's dark past will go on.
Su pare carpintero y le hará una